What if the thing you thought would destroy you turned out to be the only thing that could save you? An elderly widow, hollowed out by grief, saw something impossible while walking through the woods behind her farmhouse. A wild horse. Alone. Wearing a baby blanket tied around its neck like a forgotten prayer. The blanket was white, impossibly clean, and it belonged to her, to the child she had lost 40 years ago. What that horse was carrying, where it had come from, and the truth buried in those woods would unravel a mystery that had haunted her entire life and reveal a love so fierce it had refused to die. This is a story that will shatter you and put you back together. If you believe that some bonds transcend death and that the past never truly lets us go, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. The hill country of eastern Tennessee is a place of deep shadows and deeper silences. It is a land where the mountains rise in soft, ancient folds, covered in oak and hickory and pine. The hollows are narrow and steep, carved by creeks that run cold and clear over smooth stones. The mist clings to the valleys in the morning, thick and white, refusing to burn off until noon. It is beautiful in a lonely, aching way, a beauty that feels like morning. The town of Granger's Hollow, barely a town at all, was a scattering of old farmhouses and gravel roads tucked into the folds of the mountains. There was no main street, no post office, just families who had lived there for generations, their names carved into cemetery stones that dated back 200 years. People here kept to themselves. They worked the land. They buried their dead on their own property. They didn't ask for help and they didn't offer it. Silence was a currency. Grief was private. Susan Flynn was 72 years old, and she had lived in the same white-clapboard farmhouse her entire life. It sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by overgrown pastures and thick woods. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood stove, a porch that sagged in the middle. The paint was peeling. The roof needed repair. But it was hers. She had been born in that house. She had married in that house. She had buried her husband from that house, and she would die in that house. Her hair was gray, long, and pinned back under a gray scarf she wore every day. Her dress was black, patterned with faded flowers, the fabric worn soft from decades of washing. It hung loose on her thin frame. She moved slowly, her joints stiff, her hands gnarled with arthritis. Her face was a map of sorrow, deep lines around her mouth, eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. She lived alone. Her husband, Robert, had died 3 years ago. A stroke, fast and merciless. One moment he was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. The next, he was gone. She had found him slumped over, his hand still wrapped around the cup. She had buried him in the small cemetery at the edge of the woods, next to the graves of her parents and grandparents, next to the small white stone that marked the grave of her daughter. The daughter who had lived only 3 days. The daughter she had named Hope. That had been 40 years ago, but the grief was fresh. It had never dulled. It had carved out a hollow space in her chest that nothing could fill. Susan's days were quiet. She woke before dawn. She fed the chickens. She tended the small garden behind the house. She sat on the porch in the afternoons, shelling peas or mending clothes, listening to the wind move through the trees. She didn't go to town. She didn't have visitors. The only voice she heard was her own, and she rarely used it. On a cold morning in late October, the mist was thick. It pooled in the hollows, turning the world into a gray, shifting dream. Susan stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a mug of weak tea, staring out at the woods. She saw movement, a shape, dark against the pale mist. She squinted. It was a horse, a light brown mare standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the pasture fence. Susan frowned. There were no horses on her property. There hadn't been for 20 years, not since Robert had sold the last of them. She set down her tea and walked out onto the porch, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. The cold bit at her skin. The mare was still there. She was thin, ribs visible beneath a dull coat. Her mane was tangled. Her legs were muddy. But it wasn't the horse that made Susan's breath catch. It was what the horse was wearing. Around the mare's neck, tied with a length of frayed rope, was a blanket. A baby blanket, white, with a delicate border of embroidered flowers. Susan's knees buckled. She grabbed the porch railing, her vision swimming. She knew that blanket. She had made it herself. 40 years ago. She had sewn every stitch by hand while she was pregnant, her fingers clumsy with hope. She had wrapped her daughter in it the day she was born, and she had buried her daughter in it 3 days later. That blanket was in the grave. It had been in the grave for 40 years. So why was it around the neck of a wild horse? Susan's hand shook as she descended the porch steps. The cold air burned her lungs. The mist swirled around her ankles, thick and damp. The mare stood perfectly still, watching her approach. Her dark eyes were calm, patient, as if she had been waiting. Susan stopped 10 feet away. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rasp. "Where did you get that?" The mare didn't move. The blanket hung from her neck, draped over her shoulders like a shawl. It was dirty, stained with mud and grass, but it was unmistakably the same delicate flowers, the same soft white fabric. Susan had sewn those flowers in pale blue thread, forget-me-nots. She had chosen them because she never wanted to forget. Not the pregnancy, not the hope, not the 3 days her daughter had lived. "This isn't real, Susan," whispered. "You're not real." The mare took a step forward. Susan stepped back, her heart hammering. The horse stopped. She lowered her head, her nostrils flaring, her breath misting in the cold air. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she turned and walked back into the woods. "Wait," Susan said. Her voice was stronger now. "Wait." She followed. She didn't think. She just moved, her feet carrying her across the wet grass, through the gap in the sagging fence, into the trees. The mare moved ahead of her, a pale shadow in the mist. She didn't run. She walked slowly, as if she knew Susan couldn't keep up. The woods were dense. The ground was uneven, covered in rotting leaves and fallen branches. Susan stumbled, her breath coming in short gasps. Her knees ached, her chest burned. But she didn't stop. The mare led her deeper. Past the old logging trail. Past the creek where Susan used to take her daughter on summer afternoons before she was born, dreaming of the walks they would take together. Past the stand of white birch trees that marked the northern edge of her property. And then the mare stopped. She stood in a small clearing, surrounded by thick undergrowth. The mist here was thicker, clinging to the ground like smoke. The mare turned to face Susan. She lowered her head again, and this time she nudged the ground with her muzzle. A spot just to her left, covered in leaves. Susan's stomach twisted. She walked closer, her legs shaking. She knelt on the cold, damp ground and brushed the leaves aside. Beneath them was a stone, a small, flat, partially buried in the soil. Susan pulled it free. It was a grave marker, rough, handmade, carved with a single word. Hope. Susan's breath stopped. This wasn't her daughter's grave. Her daughter was buried in the cemetery behind the house. Susan had put the stone there herself. She had laid the blanket in the tiny coffin herself. She had watched as Robert lowered it into the ground. So what was this? She looked at the mare. The horse was still watching her. Calm. Waiting. Susan's hands trembled as she dug into the soil. It was soft, loose, as if it had been disturbed recently. She clawed at it, her nails filling with dirt, her breath ragged. And then her fingers hit something. Fabric. She pulled. A bundle, wrapped in old rotten cloth. She laid it on the ground and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a wooden box. Small, the size of a shoebox. The wood was warped and stained, but it was intact. Susan's heart was a wild, painful thing in her chest. She opened the box. Inside, folded carefully, was a letter. The paper was yellowed, brittle. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. Susan unfolded it with trembling hands and read, "Susan, if you are reading this, then I'm dead and you have finally found the truth. I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry. Your baby did not die. She lived. I took her. I gave her to my sister in Knoxville. I told you she died because I thought it was for the best. You were so young, so poor. Robert was drinking. I thought she would have a better life. I thought I was saving her. I was wrong. I have carried this lie for 40 years. I buried this letter here because I could not bury the guilt. The blanket in the grave is a copy. I made it myself. The real one I sent with her. Forgive me. Your mother." Susan's vision blurred. The words swam. She read it again and again. Her mother. Her mother had taken her baby, had lied, had told her the baby died, had let her grieve for 40 years, for a child who was alive. The scream that tore from Susan's throat was raw, primal. It echoed through the trees, scattering birds, shattering the silence. The mare didn't flinch. She just stood there, the white blanket still draped around her neck, watching. Susan collapsed onto the ground, the letter clutched in her fist. Her body shook with sobs that felt like they would tear her apart. 40 years. 40 years of grief, of loss, of a hollow ache that had defined her entire life. And it had all been a lie. Her daughter was alive, or had been. The letter didn't say if she was still alive. It didn't say where she was. It didn't say anything except that Susan's entire life had been built on a foundation of deceit. She didn't know how long she sat there. The mist shifted. The cold seeped into her bones. The mare stayed. She didn't leave. She stood a few feet away, her head low, her eyes on Susan. Finally, Susan's sobs quieted. She wiped her face with her shaking hands. She looked at the mare. "You brought me here," she whispered. "Why?" The mare didn't answer. Of course she didn't, but Susan felt, with a strange, terrible certainty, that the horse had led her here for a reason, that this wasn't chance. She stood, her legs weak, and walked to the mare. She reached out, her hand hovering over the blanket. Slowly, carefully, she untied the rope. The blanket slipped free. Susan held it in her hands. It was real, solid. The embroidered flowers were faded but still visible. She buried her face in it, inhaling. It smelled of earth and horse and time. But beneath that, faint and distant, she thought she smelled something else. Baby powder, milk, a memory. The mare turned and walked away. Susan didn't follow this time. She watched as the horse disappeared into the mist, a ghost dissolving into the trees. Then she looked down at the letter in her hand, at the blanket, at the truth that had been hidden for 40 years. And she made a decision. She was going to find her daughter. Susan walked back to the house in a daze. The world felt different, sharper. The mist had burned off, leaving the sky a pale, washed-out blue. The trees stood stark and black against it. Her body moved on autopilot. She crossed the pasture. She climbed the porch steps. She walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. She spread the letter out in front of her. She read it again, slowly, carefully, looking for details she'd missed. The only new information was the mention of Knoxville, her mother's sister. Susan had vague memories of her, a woman named Dorothy, tall, stern. She had visited once or twice when Susan was a child, but Susan hadn't seen her in decades, didn't know if she was still alive, didn't even know her last name. She tried to remember. Her mother's maiden name was Caldwell, so Dorothy would have been Dorothy Caldwell, unless she'd married. Susan's hands clenched. She had no phone, no computer, no way to search. The nearest library was 30 miles away in the town of Ashton. She hadn't been there in years. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the bedroom and pulled a metal lockbox from under the bed. Inside was $300 in cash. Money Robert had hidden away for emergencies. She took it all. She changed into a clean dress, still black, still long. She wrapped a fresh scarf around her hair. She put on her coat. And she walked out to the old truck parked beside the barn. It was a 1987 Ford, rusted, dented. It hadn't been driven in over a year. Susan climbed in, her hands shaking. She turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. She tried again. The engine turned over. It rattled and wheezed, but it ran. Susan sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. She hadn't driven in years. She hadn't left the property in months. But she was going now. She was going to find her daughter. The drive to Ashton took an hour. The truck groaned and shuddered on the winding mountain roads. Susan's knuckles were white on the wheel. She passed other cars. She passed farmhouses and trailers and churches. She passed a world that had continued without her, a world she had forgotten existed. The library was a small brick building on Main Street. Susan parked, her legs stiff, and walked inside. The librarian, a young woman with bright red hair, looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" "I need to find someone," Susan said. Her voice was rough, unused. The librarian smiled. "Do you have a name?" "Dorothy Caldwell. She lived in Knoxville, maybe 40 years ago." The librarian's smile faltered. "That's not much to go on." "I know," Susan said, "but it's all I have." The librarian sighed. She stood and led Susan to a computer. She showed her how to use the search engine, how to look through old records, public databases. Susan's hands hovered over the keyboard. She had never used a computer, but she tried. She typed slowly, painfully. The librarian helped. They searched for an hour, then 2. And finally they found something. A Dorothy Caldwell, age 89, living in a nursing home in Knoxville. The address was listed. Susan wrote it down with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered. The librarian looked at her. "You okay?" Susan nodded. She wasn't. But she didn't know how to explain. The nursing home was 3 hours away. Susan drove through the afternoon, the sun sinking low and red behind the mountains. Her body ached. Her mind was a storm. She didn't know what she would say, didn't know what she would find. But she kept driving. The nursing home was a low, sprawling building on the edge of the city. It smelled of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman in scrubs, looked up as Susan approached. "I'm here to see Dorothy Caldwell." The woman checked her computer. "Room 214. Down the hall, second door on the right. Susan walked slowly. Her heart was a hammer. Her hands were ice. She stopped outside the door. It was partially open. She could see inside. A small room, a single bed, a woman sitting in a chair by the window. She was old, skeletal, her hair white and thin, her hands folded in her lap. She stared out the window at nothing. Susan knocked. The woman didn't turn. Dorothy. The woman's head moved, slowly. She looked at Susan. Her eyes were clouded with age, confused. Who are you? Susan. Susan Flynn, your niece. Dorothy's face didn't change. She stared. Then slowly, something shifted. A flicker of recognition. Susan. Yes. Dorothy's mouth opened, closed. You shouldn't be here. I need to know about my daughter, Susan said. Her voice was shaken. You took her. You gave her to someone. I need to know where she is. Dorothy's face crumpled. She looked away. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Susan said. She stepped into the room. My mother wrote a letter. She said she gave my baby to you, that you took her to Knoxville. I need to know where she is. Dorothy was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice a thin, brittle whisper. She's dead. Susan's world tilted. What? She died 2 years ago. Cancer. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. I raised her. I loved her. But she's gone. Susan couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. No. Yes, Dorothy said. I'm sorry. I thought I was helping. Your mother thought she was helping. We were wrong. What was her name? Susan whispered. Dorothy looked at her. Diana. I called her Diana. Susan sat down heavily in the chair across from Dorothy. The name echoed in her mind. Diana. Her daughter's name was Diana. And she was dead. She had lived. She had grown up. She had had a life. And Susan had missed all of it. Did she know? Susan asked. Her voice was hollow. Did she know about me? Dorothy shook her head. No. I told her she was mine. I never told her the truth. Why? Because I was ashamed, Dorothy said. Tears slipped down her wrinkled cheeks. Because I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't undo it. Susan stared at her. The anger she expected to feel didn't come. There was only exhaustion, only a vast, aching emptiness. Did she have children? Susan asked. Dorothy nodded. One. A daughter. She lives here, in Knoxville. Susan's heart stuttered. A granddaughter. She had a granddaughter. What's her name? Dorothy hesitated. Then she said, Levi. Levi Fletcher. She's a teacher. She doesn't know about you either. Susan stood. Where can I find her? Dorothy gave her an address, a phone number. But then she reached out, her bony hand gripping Susan's wrist. Don't tell her, Dorothy said. Please, it will only hurt her. She's already lost her mother. Don't take away the memory she has. Susan pulled her hand free. That's not your choice to make. She walked out. The drive back to the farmhouse was a blur. Susan's mind was full of names. Hope, Diana, Levi. A daughter she had never known. A granddaughter she had never met. A life that had been stolen from her. When she arrived home, the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with red and purple. The farmhouse looked small and lonely against the darkening hills. Susan walked inside. She sat at the kitchen table. The blanket was still there, folded carefully. She touched it, and for the first time in 40 years she allowed herself to imagine. A baby, growing up, laughing, learning to walk, to read, to love. A woman, living a full life. A life Susan had been robbed of, but also a life that had been lived, and that, somehow, mattered. The next morning, Susan woke before dawn. She made coffee. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the mist rise from the hollows. The mare appeared again. She walked out of the woods, moving slowly, her head low. She stopped at the edge of the pasture and looked at Susan. Susan stood. She walked down the steps and across the wet grass. She stopped in front of the mare. "Thank you," she said quietly. The mare's ears flicked forward. Susan reached out and touched the horse's neck. The coat was rough and matted. The horse was thin, uncared for, wild, but her eyes were calm, knowing. "You brought me the truth," Susan whispered. "I don't know how. I don't know why. But you did." The mare lowered her head, resting it against Susan's shoulder. And Susan, who had not allowed herself to feel anything but grief for so long, felt something else. Gratitude. She spent the day preparing. She cleaned the barn. She bought hay and grain with the last of her money. She fixed the fence. And when the mare appeared again that evening, Susan opened the gate. "Come on," she said. "You can stay." The mare walked in. She ate. She drank. She stood in the barn, sheltered and safe. And Susan, for the first time in decades, did not feel alone. Over the following week, Susan thought about Levi, her granddaughter. She didn't call. She didn't write. She didn't know what to say. But she thought about her. One afternoon, as she was brushing the mare's coat, she made a decision. She would go to Knoxville. She would meet Levi. Not to disrupt her life. Not to take anything from her, but to see her. Just once. To know that part of Diana still existed in the world. The drive took 3 hours. Susan's hands shook on the wheel. The address Dorothy had given her was a small house on a quiet street, a tidy yard, a swing on the porch. Susan parked across the street. She sat there, her heart pounding. And then the door opened. A woman stepped out. She was in her 30s, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater. She walked to the mailbox. Susan couldn't breathe. The woman looked like her. Like Susan had looked 40 years ago. The same eyes, the same mouth, the same way of moving. Diana's daughter, Susan's granddaughter. The woman opened the mailbox, pulled out a stack of envelopes, and walked back inside. The door closed. Susan sat there for a long time. She didn't knock. She didn't introduce herself. She just sat there, watching the house, knowing that inside was a piece of her daughter, a piece of herself. And it was enough. For now, it was enough. Susan drove home as the sun set. The sky was a deep, bruised purple. The mountains were black silhouettes. The farmhouse was dark when she arrived. She walked inside, lit a lantern, and sat at the table. She thought about Diana, about the life she had lived, about Levi, about the future that still existed. And she thought about the mare, the horse that had carried the blanket. That had led her to the truth. Susan didn't understand it. She didn't try to. She simply accepted it. The next morning, she walked out to the barn. The mare was standing in the stall, calm and quiet. Susan fed her, brushed her, talked to her. "You're staying, aren't you?" Susan said. The mare's ears flicked forward. "Good. I need you." Over the following months, Susan changed. She started going to town. She bought supplies. She spoke to people. She joined a small church group that met on Sundays. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer silent. And the mare stayed. She grazed in the pasture. She stood in the barn. She waited by the fence every morning, watching the house. Susan called her keeper, because that's what she was. A keeper of secrets, a keeper of truth. One afternoon in early spring, Susan sat on the porch, mending a dress. She heard a car coming up the drive. She looked up. A small sedan, unfamiliar. The car stopped. The door opened. A woman stepped out. Dark hair, familiar face. "Levi?" Susan's heart stopped. The woman walked toward the porch, her expression uncertain. "Are you Susan Flynn?" Yes, Susan said. Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm Levi Fletcher. I think you knew my mother. Susan nodded. She couldn't speak. Levi looked at her. I found some old letters. After my mother died, letters from a woman named Dorothy. They mentioned you. They mentioned a baby. Susan's hands clenched. Levi's eyes filled with tears. Were you my grandmother? Susan stood. Her legs were shaking. Yes. Levi's face crumpled. She covered her mouth with her hand, a sob escaping. Susan walked down the steps. She stopped in front of Levi. They stared at each other. Then Levi stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Susan. They stood there, two strangers bound by blood and loss, and a truth that had been hidden for too long. And Susan, who had spent 40 years grieving a ghost, finally understood. Her daughter had lived, she had been loved, and her legacy was standing here, in this moment, holding her. It was enough, it was more than enough. Levi stayed, not forever, but for a week. She and Susan talked, they shared stories. Levi told her about Diana, about the woman she had been. Kind, strong, a teacher, a mother, a wife who had died too young. Susan listened, she cried, she laughed. She learned about the life her daughter had lived, and she told Levi the truth. About the letter, about the blanket, about the mare. Levi didn't believe her at first, but then Susan took her to the barn, showed her keeper, showed her the blanket. And Levi, holding the soft white fabric in her hands, looked at the mare and whispered, "Thank you." Before Levi left, she made Susan a promise. "I'll come back. Every month. You're not alone anymore." Susan stood on the porch, watching the car drive away. The mare walked up beside her, her warm breath on Susan's shoulder. "You brought her to me," Susan whispered. The mare's ears flicked forward, and Susan understood. The blanket, the truth, the journey. It had all been leading to this, to connection, to family, to a second chance. The years that followed were different. Levi visited. She brought her husband, her children, Susan's great-grandchildren. The farmhouse, once silent and cold, filled with laughter, with life, with love. And the mare stayed. She grazed in the pasture. She stood by the fence. She watched over them all. Susan never learned where Keeper had come from, never learned how she had found the blanket, never learned why she had led Susan to the truth. But it didn't matter. Some things couldn't be explained. Some miracles defied logic. And Susan, who had spent her entire life believing she had lost everything, learned that some bonds could not be broken. That love, once given, never truly died. That even in the darkest grief, hope could be found. On a warm afternoon in late summer, Susan sat on the porch, watching her great-grandchildren play in the yard. Levi sat beside her, holding her hand. The mare grazed nearby, her coat shining in the sun. Susan looked at the blanket, now framed and hanging on the wall inside, at the horse who had carried it, at the family who had returned. And she understood. She had not lost her daughter. She had found her. In the truth, in the legacy, in the love that had refused to die. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that some mysteries are meant to heal us, please subscribe and share this video. Because every secret carries a truth. Every loss holds a seed of hope. And sometimes the past doesn't haunt us. It saves us.